I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to episode 119 of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati. Our esteemed guest is my pastor, the lead pastor of Crossroads Community Church. John Snyder is with us today. Hello, John. How are you?
Doing well, Kyle. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, this is special, and I will say I would doubt that any other year I would be able to get a pastor to spend time on an interview during Easter week. I think that's probably an anomaly.
It's a pretty crazy week, but yeah.
So with all the COVID-19 craziness going on, I think it's important for people really at any time, but especially right now, to really look to God for guidance. And as a spiritual leader, as the lead pastor of our church, that's something that you're walking people through both one-on-one, but then also in large congregations. So what are some of the things that you think about as people are kind of not sure where they're going or when there's uncertainty? And I think there's a lot of this discussion right now that we're in this uncertain time, or we're in this great time of confusion or uncertainty. And I believe really, if you look back at it, things are always uncertain. And maybe we have a false sense of security at times. So as a pastor, how do you help people work through that? And what are some of the things that you think about as you work folks through maybe not knowing where they're going?
I agree with you. Nothing is certain, but there's times when we sense more uncertainty than others. I believe we need God to get through everything, and I understand that not everyone feels that way, but the way I put it is this. We desperately need oxygen every day. But we don't wake up in the morning scared to death oxygen won't be there. We just take for granted that we always will have enough air to breathe. I believe God is around us all the time, and there are times when we sense our desperate need for Him more than others, just like there's times we sense our desperate need for oxygen more than others. If we were in an oxygen-deprived environment, we would panic immediately. So I think the times we're going through have raised our sensitivity to how desperate we are, or how uncertain things are. And the things that I share with people is I even like the serenity prayer that Alcoholics Anonymous pray. God, I don't remember it exactly, but God grant me the ability to accept the things I can change, and help me have the power or the strength to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's some things we are not in control of at all. And when that happens, either we have to say we're here by accident and we don't know what's going to happen, or we say there's a greater power that we can turn to and trust in. Our culture has been through the Spanish flu in 1918, through World War I, through the Great Depression, through World War II, through 9/11. There's all kinds of times of uncertainty. And what's interesting is almost every single one of those times raise a spiritual sensitivity in people's lives where they go, we need God. So the way I help people is I say, I'll pray for you. And it's amazing how often that means something. Or I share from the Bible powerful truths that encourage people. There's other truths outside of Scripture that people look to about, perseverance or hanging on and believing. But I think just being there for people as much as you can, sharing positive truth, believing the best, praying. God got us through the Spanish flu, World War I, the Great Depression, World War, all these things. A lot of lives were lost, a lot of painful things happened, but He'll get us on the other side of this as well. And with it being Easter week, one of the things you've heard me say, Kyle, I say a lot is, if God could turn the crucifixion and the resurrection, He could take whatever problem we're facing and somehow, even though we don't know how, turn it to good.
I love that answer. And throughout it, I heard prayer. And one of the things that we spoke about as we were prepping, and for our podcast audience, this might be a little uncomfortable, but as a non-denominational Christian, we pray. We pray for each other in small groups, one-on-one, but then also in larger groups. One of the things that you do prior to addressing our congregation, or one of the other pastors will do this prior to worship, is you'll say a prayer. Now, our audience are leaders. They're leaders in the real estate space, and it's not just here in Colorado, it's all across the nation. There's a lot of people of faith that listen to this podcast, but there's some that this may strike a chord, and they may be at home, they may be in a spot where they don't have the typical hustle and bustle. They don't have their normal routine. And this may be a great opportunity to pray for those folks who are really yearning for some spiritual enrichment. So let's do that very quickly, and then let's go into the rest of our interview.
Okay. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that we aren't here by accident. I thank you that you are a benevolent, caring creator, that what's going on in our world doesn't catch you off guard, that even if people are stuck with stay-at-home orders or they're in the hospital, they're sick, they are not alone. I'm not alone. You are with us. The most repeated command in the Bible is fear not. It's said over and over and over again, and the most repeated promise is I am with you. I don't know the people listening to this podcast, but I pray whoever they are, wherever they are, even if they don't know or believe you're true, that they would sense your presence and they would know you are with them, and that would bring them a new level of peace and strength to face what's going on. In your name, amen.
Amen. Praise the Lord. Okay. One of the things I know from sitting in the congregation, listening to you preach on a weekly basis for the past 8 years, and I had to pinch myself for a moment to think that I walked into Crossroads in 2012 from a couple of major men in my life that prompted me that I really needed to check my spirituality. And those three men were Rory Vaden, which you and I have talked about, and Rory was interviewed in episode 100. It was Marcus Vigil, who's a Denver police officer and good friends of ours. Courtney and I have been friends with Blair and Marcus for decades now. And my business partner at the time, Greg Johnson, who is an elder at Eastern Hills Community Church, which is where Pastor Chris Howe came from. Those three men, all at the same time, I felt like they were just really working me to say that I really needed to have some spiritual enrichment in my life. So I was in a wilderness period when I walked into Crossroads in 2012. And what I didn't know as I walked into a brand new, sparkling, shining building was that was the brand new building and the launch of a church that didn't start out that way. So what was it like to move campuses? And that's something you've spoken to a lot of our congregation, but I think for real estate agents, for real estate professionals, they'll know that moving is stressful. Moving takes a lot of time and energy, and it takes some vision as the leader to cast that vision. So let's talk about the history of the church, because I think it really applies to talking about uncertainty and how God can lead us even though we don't know where we're going.
Well, I know I've been real honest that, and you know this story, that I went to college to be a pastor. I went to seminary, got a master's degree. I was in ministry, but after a number of successful ventures in different churches as a youth pastor and starting a church from scratch, I ended up at a church that wasn't a good fit. After 5 years, the leader said, you know, you haven't done anything immoral or unbiblical or sinful, but it's not a good fit. And they told me they didn't think I could have an ongoing effective ministry, so they invited me to leave. For 9 months, I was out of ministry. I didn't know if I wanted to be a pastor anymore. It's a very discouraging time. And I realized that everybody in the Bible that I admire went through a season of life where they said, where are you, God? Life is hard. You know, in America, everything is supposed to go up and to the right, you know, on the charts. And when I read the Bible, almost every hero of the Bible, every hero I can think of, their life went up and down. It didn't go straight up. And so when I came to Crossroads in 2003, there were 80 people. And I thought I'd be the pastor of a small church the rest of my life. I've heard a quote, maybe you've heard it too, that says people overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate what they can do in 5 years. And so the church began to heal. I began to heal from my discouragement. And we grew about 120 people a year every year. And by 2010, we had already had 3 services on Sunday. We had to have a 4th service on Saturday night. And by 2011, we said, we were in 1 acre of land. We bought another acre for parking. We were in a building that was built in the 60s that had a septic tank and a well. When I came every 2 years, they would pump the septic tank. Then every year, then every 6 months. The last couple of years, they came every Monday to check because we had like 1,100, 1,200 people, you know, filling up the septic tank. And And we realized we couldn't stay where we were. We could stay there, but if we did, it limited the influence and the impact and the ability to encourage people we had. And it was a scary time because when I came to the church, they were $40,000 in debt with 80 people. By this time in 2010, 2011, we had $300,000 in the bank. We thought we were a huge success. I didn't want to go in debt, but we knew if we sold the property and moved somewhere, we'd be in trouble. And we did a lot of praying, and we even said we were afraid some of our values and some of the personality of our church would change if we went to a larger facility. We wanted to stay a relational place. It was a difficult time, and I said, am I going to lead our church into a season of debt after we've had a season of savings? But we gathered a lot of wise people. We hired a consultant. We started looking at 20 acres of land. The consultant at that time in 2010 and 11 said, hey, you know, there's kind of a declined economy, which is bad news for how people can give generously, but it's good news because there's large buildings that are open. That are already built. You wouldn't have to get permits. You wouldn't have to buy property and then build. And he encouraged us to start looking. And I remember we made 3 offers on a car dealership in Parker that had been vacated for 2 or 3 years. It was about 5 years old. They didn't even listen to our first 3 offers. We went and made another offer on an old King Super building that was really run down, and they said they had someone else. Finally, a number of months later, Chrysler had sold a division of their company to a bank in Canada, and that bank said, we will sell you this building. And I got to tell you, it was just stressful for everyone. I'm trying to raise money in a nonprofit, asking people to give so we can move somewhere, saying, I don't know what that's going to look like. Finally, when we moved in, we could barely afford the place. It's kind of like being house poor. In February 29th of 2012, we took ownership. I remember it was leap year day. We moved in July, just 4 months later. And the amazing thing was, in all the uncertainty and not being sure, in March, a man walked in my office and said he'd sold an oil and gas business, and God had stirred his heart to give $1 million check to our church. And the crazy thing is we had about 200, 300 families that had made commitments to give $1.2 million over 3 years, and then in one day this man doubled it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was a stretching, you never know what's going to happen kind of time.
That's a great answer to the question, and it begs the next question. The follow-up question is, I think as an ambitious person, and I have always been diligent, I feel the diligent in Proverbs, the diligent prosper. And that's something that has always been a proverb that's been important to me. So sometimes my own ambitions, I feel like sometimes I'm in this tension between, is this God telling me to do this? Or is this maybe my own selfish desire? Is this my ego? Is this something I just want to do for my own family? And I think that that's very difficult for our audience at times to understand. Is this God prompting me? Is this a call from God? Or is this really my own ambition? And how do you work through that? Because leading a large group of people, it's not only just your own thoughts, but obviously you have a lot of other people, volunteers, you've got staff members, you've got all these things. So at what point do you realize it is a call from God instead of your own ambition?
I think as long as you're human, no matter how hard we try, there'll be mixed motives. Again, because I'm a pastor, I look for examples from the Bible. And I guess what I would say is, if I'm honest with myself, or I have wise mentors or people I trust who look me in the eye and say, you aren't doing this for other people, you're doing this for yourself. That's when I say, you know what, this is probably not a prompting from God. If someone, the example in the Old Testament is, if you read in the Bible, there's the Tower of Babel, and people get together, and God had told them to go into all the earth, but they say, let's get together, let's stay together, let's build a tower in our name, and God disperses them. That was a man-made vision instead of a God-given vision. Almost every time in the Bible when God asks someone to do something, they don't want to do it. God shows up to Moses and said, you're going to deliver the people of Israel from Egypt. And he says, ask somebody else. So I guess a test I've had more intuitively is if I have a prompting in my heart to do something, is it something that almost makes me uncomfortable? And will it benefit others more than it benefits me? Is when I say, and I've had different promptings. Had a prompting at 13 to become a pastor. It kind of freaked me out. I didn't know what that would mean. I had a prompting after I'd been a youth pastor to go start a church in Arizona from scratch, and I was scared to death. I didn't know if people would support it, but it seemed like the right thing to do, and a good thing to do. And when we were at Crossroads, it would have been safer to stay where we were, but I sensed God wanted to do more, and it kind of scared us, like, are we going to fail? And the Bible talks about selfish ambition as opposed to, a godly kind of peace about something. I will say I'm still human. I still have an ego, and I'm sure even in the times when I sense God prompting me to do things, there's been some selfishness in it too, and I try to discern that, but I trust that God can overcome my my ego if it's the right thing to do.
One of the things I enjoy about hearing your sermons, Pastor John, is you mentioned that as a spiritual leader, but also as the leader of a nonprofit, of a large organization, you've read a lot of the positivity books, a lot of the leadership development books. Self-help is what people used to call them, and now it's more of the personal growth category. I have over my shoulder several John C. Maxwell books, the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, Failing Forward. He's becoming one of my favorite authors, and he's been around a long time. I just finished reading one of his recent books, and we didn't prep for this, but I think it's apropos to what you just said. And this is The Leader's Greatest Return. It's a great book. I rented it from Arapahoe County Libraries. John says, one of the greatest enemies of effective leadership is an arrival mindset. The day leaders think they have arrived, they stopped actively leading. Instead, they focus on trying to hold on to their place based on tenure, status, position, or history. When that happens, their leadership suffers. If they think they've arrived, they will no longer work hard to produce. And he goes on to say they won't roll up their sleeves, et cetera, et cetera. And John was a pastor prior to becoming a speaker and motivational leader and author and all the things John C. Maxwell is. And so I think that's really the essence. And you shared, you get wise counsel. You surround people that know you, they know your heart, but they also know what's important for the greater good of the organization. You obviously pray, and I think that that's an important element of it that we'll get into here in a little bit. And in one of your recent sermons, where you really talked about the idea of, if I don't know where I am going, but I feel like God is leading me and God is calling me, you came up with 5 steps. And I'm going to go through those quickly and let you speak about them in more detail. You said that you need to listen to God's calling and his prompting to you. You need to obey his calling is number 2. Number 3, go where God leads you. Number 4, settle down where he leads. And number 5, inherit what he promises. And all this comes out of Hebrews 11:6, 11:8 through 10, where we're talking about Abraham and Abraham's faith and what God led him to do. So as you're thinking about this, as you're going through some of these big moves, how do you just go through that idea of, I want to constantly be pursuing and growing, because I think it's important and it's biblical to grow, and making sure that you're doing it in a sustainable way that doesn't break the back of the church or somehow sink us into debt or things of that sort?
If you to read that story, God told Abraham where to go, and he didn't know where he was going. He just followed. You have heard me say, I know you have 5 F's that you kind of live your life around. But I believe that as we make decisions about moving into the future, there's 3 F's. Some people are foolish, and they get way ahead of, and they have, I've read the books on BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, and I've had friends who've made them, and I think were foolish. They got way ahead of themselves, and they failed completely. The other F that's on the other side of the spectrum is fear, where we're so afraid that we might make a mistake or it won't work that we don't do anything. And I think faith is in between fear and foolishness. And faith is the word I like more is trust, to trust that I'm doing the right thing. You mentioned John Maxwell. I was exposed to John Maxwell when he was a pastor. I went to his the first conference I went to was in the mid 80s, and there were 200 pastors in a room. And I have been reading his books and listened to his tapes since. He's probably the person I've read the most. He had a quote that I used when I started the church and that I kept on my refrigerator, that I have on my phone, that says, "Until I'm committed, there's a hesitancy, a chance to draw back. But the moment I definitely commit myself, then God moves also, and a whole stream of events erupt. All manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, and persons and material assistance, which I never could have dreamed would come my way, begin to flow around me and toward me the moment I make a commitment." And so I think it's, you wrestle, you struggle, you seek wise counsel, and then you have to make a decision and you have to go for it. And if you're foolish and you fail, you learn. Hopefully you learn. You don't just give up. So I've, made plenty of mistakes in the process, but I have found when you being decisive and finding other people who affirm what you feel you're doing and teaming up together, all of a sudden, it's just amazing the things that come together that you would never have expected.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that what occurs sometimes for especially younger aspiring leaders or people who are hoping to seek success in some sort of area of their life, what occurs at times is they feel like, well, if I see someone else who's had success, and you share a great analogy to this that I want to make sure that you share. But if I see someone else that has success, I almost feel like they kind of have always been that way. They were dropped on top of the mountaintop. And the reality is there's plenty of stories, biblical heroes that go through these wilderness periods and through valleys and through a lot of hardship. You went through a depression, and that's something you speak openly about as a pastor, as a man, as someone who's an optimistic extrovert. That's something that a lot of people would maybe raise an eyebrow at. And I appreciate your honesty, your authenticity, and your vulnerability in talking about that. So what were some of the things that kind of led to that season of depression? It was a brief season, but what led to that? What did you learn from it? And how, most importantly, did you kind of get out of it and recover from that? Because I think mental health is very important right now while people are out of their normal day-to-day routine. And I think there's a lot of people that are battling loneliness. And I would just love to hear kind of your thoughts on how you worked through that own wilderness period of yours.
I was in denial about it a bit. By God's grace, I have lived a very blessed life. I did really well in high school, made all conference in football. I didn't graduate back, the valedictorian. I was like number 7 out of 300 and some. I did well in college. I graduated cum laude. Of course, my roommate was magna cum laude. I mean, I was never the top dog of anything. I went to seminary and did really well in seminary. I started as a youth pastor for 7 years in Southern California and saw a huge positive impact. I started a church in Arizona that kind of started a whole movement of churches starting for the conference I was a part of in Arizona. And then I came to this church in Colorado, and for the first time in my life, bumped up against a situation where people said, "You aren't the right guy." But if you back way up in the story, the truth, my dad died when I was 5 years old of cancer. My mom was an amazing mother and told us God was our father, the best father anybody could have. I believed her. But a counselor, when I realized I was depressed after this other church, actually before the church invited me to leave, I began to struggle with depression because I had all kinds of people criticizing me and picking at things that had never happened before. It was a very negative environment. A stronger leader would have done well there, but it was kind of causing me to implode. I went to a counselor, and one thing she said is, every little boy wants a hero. Who was your hero when you grew up and when your dad died? And I knew immediately it was my older brother. He was 4 years older than me. I was 2 when my dad got sick and 5 when he died. I didn't understand it. My older brother was 6 when my dad got sick and 9 when he died. And my older brother was an angry young boy, and who can blame him? And what 9-year-old wants his annoying 5-year-old brother around all the time? And I did everything I could to please Lawson. And I had this false assumption that settled in my heart as a little boy that if I did anything, if Lawson was ever angry, I must have done something wrong and I had to fix it. And I believe that as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old boy, I couldn't discern when Lawson's anger had nothing to do with me. I just knew he was angry and I didn't want him to be. he was so important to me that as I got older, I thought no one important to me should be angry. And if they are, I must have done something wrong and I have to fix it. And then I'm a pastor of a church. No one in my church should be, and I'm carrying around the weight of the world. On top of that, I'm a people person, which serves me well. But in my weakness, I become a people pleaser. I would even apologize for things I didn't do wrong just to calm people down. Then I was conflicted. And I thought it wasn't a good Christian thing to be angry. So, 17, 18 years ago, if something bad happened, you say, how are you doing, John? I'd say, I'm fine. And I was lying to myself. They say depression is frozen rage. And I finally realized I'd read all the John Maxwell, Zig Ziglar positive thinking books. And, you can be as happy as you make up your mind to be. And when I went to see this counselor, I thought if this is normal, I was this depressed. And after she started poking around in my soul, I realized I was this depressed, but all the positive thinking books made me think I was only, but I had to unlearn the way I approached other people's anger and how I dealt with my own anger. And it was a really difficult time. In fact, Carol, the counselor I saw, said, I don't think you're clinically depressed. I think you're circumstantially depressed. I think if you were on antidepressants for a season of your life, it would help. And I was embarrassed because, I'm a man, we don't admit we have problems to ourselves or anyone else. I'm a Christian. I'm supposed to have the joy of the Lord. And 3, I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to have answers, not questions. But I was hurting enough. I said, okay. And I read a pamphlet that says 1 out of 3 people in America go through some season of deep discouragement or depression in their life. And I thought, how arrogant am I if I were to think I may not be one of those people? It was during that season while I was on antidepressants is when the church invited me to leave. I went through 9 months of what I call the year of uncertainty in my life. I couldn't pay bills. I didn't know if I wanted to be a pastor. I didn't think anybody would want me to be. I did sales for a neighbor and did well. But as I was going through it, I realized everybody in the Bible, people know Joseph with a coat of many colors. And, he was his father's favorite son, and he had great dreams of being great, but his brothers hated him and sold him into slavery. And for 13 years, from when he's 17 till 30, he's a slave or a prisoner. And he's got to be saying, where are you, God? And Moses, was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, but at 40, he kills an Egyptian. And for 40 years, he's in the wilderness doing nothing. And the Apostle Paul hated Christians, became a Christian. Then the Bible tells he probably spent 14 years making tents, and everyone forgot about him before he became this great leader. And so what I realized is we all struggle in life, and I forget who it was. It said it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up. It's not how many difficulties come at you in life, it's how you deal with those difficulties. Slowly but surely, I got weaned off the antidepressants. I was being weaned off. I was out of ministry for 9 months. So my first month at the church, the new church, with 80 people, I was being weaned off. I started getting healthy spiritually and emotionally with counseling and encouragement. The church started getting healthy and growing. And to me, it's just this amazing recovery story for me and for Crossroads.
A beautiful story, and I've heard it before. I think it's important for our audience to hear it. So thank you for sharing it. And I'm sure that it's one of those things, like a lot of people, and I haven't necessarily gone through that exact story myself, but I would imagine that as you share it, you sort of relive it, and some of those old feelings get conjured up. And I think that at times for extroverts, and a lot of people that listen to this are in sales, a lot of people, and I very much relate to the people pleaser issue and wanting to take care of everything and becoming basically a wreck and overwhelming myself and losing energy and because I'm giving it to everybody else. And I would imagine as a pastor, that's very common. So I think that it's important to share that. And I appreciate you saying what you just did about that season of your life.
Share something else.
Yes.
People have a perception of who you are, who I am. Our church that had 80 people in it in 2003, now we average 2,400 a weekend. We have 4 services. And sometimes people say, wow, he's lived this charmed life. When I was a youth pastor, I had a mentor I respected deeply who told me one day and told 2 other people, John will never make a good lead pastor because he cares too much. And it's like, what? My mentor just told me I'm not going to be able to do the thing I want to do. And he was a good guy. He wasn't against me. Then after I'd been a youth pastor for 7 years, my wife and I went to a church planter assessment center, a place where they evaluate if you have the kind of personality that would be good and entrepreneurial enough to start a church. And it was a 3-day thing with 7 or 8 other couples. And the leader was nationally known for church planting. And he sat down with me and my wife and said, you have a 30% chance of making it as a church planter. Our whole team is unanimous, and we think you ought to quit your job and move to Long Beach, California, and let someone else mentor you. And I was just devastated because he told me I couldn't make it as a church planter. I was working with another conference. I actually had him write a 3-page letter explaining the results because I said, I'm too emotional. Remember what you said. And I handed it to the leaders of the conference I was a part of. And they talked to people they knew and said, we still want you to plant a church. And maybe what that did is make me humble because I was on my knees saying, dear God, don't let him be right. And then after I started the church for 5 years, I worked with a friend. I was the lead pastor. He was the executive pastor. And he came after 5 years and said he thought he was more of a leader than I was. And he should be the lead pastor and I should be the teaching pastor. And we went through weeks of conversation. And finally, I said, you're a great leader. Maybe you're supposed to go start another church. And we sent people to help him. But that was a painful time in my life. Then I went to this church in Colorado. And 4 years into it, they said, they had come to the unanimous opinion it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for me to have an ongoing effective ministry, and they invited me to leave. And I feel like every time someone said those things, I needed to take them seriously because everyone who said them, they weren't enemies. But I had to look in my heart and say, are they right? And do I give up? I think that was God testing me, saying, will you follow my calling? I don't want to be foolish, but by God's grace, the church we started in Arizona started a whole movement of churches. So that guy was wrong. And my mentor, I mean, I'm a lead pastor, and people say one of the greatest strengths is I am compassionate and caring. And even though this other church in the same community I'm in now said I couldn't have an ongoing effective ministry in the community, I have a more effective ministry than I've ever had. So I guess I'd say, the quote we all hear is, failure isn't failure. It's just a chance to learn and get up and keep going. So.
Well, and I know that you're a compassionate guy. One of the things that really drew me to Pastor John as I walked in to the church in 2012 with my family for the first time, having grown up Catholic and never experiencing a non-denominational worship service. It was one of those situations where you walk in and everybody's welcoming. Pastor John is a pat on the back, side hug, handshake type of guy if he doesn't know you. And that feels like a strange thing to say in our COVID-19 world where we're doing elbow bumps and, we're waving from 6 to 10 feet away. But Pastor John, if he doesn't know you, will make a point to say hello to you, write your name down, keeps a little note card in his back pocket, prays over the congregation every Saturday. I mean, this is a man that really cares about his flock, about the people he's leading. And so I definitely agree that I know that you are a compassionate person. And I think that is what makes you special as a lead pastor. The Easter story. We've got to talk about the fact that obviously we're recording this Easter week. This will launch actually on Good Friday. And I believe that the Easter story is one of the greatest examples of how we can be optimistic that tomorrow's a new day full of possibility. So for those that haven't heard the Easter story, I know there are some, and there are some that are probably more importantly skeptical of the Easter story. So for those that might be skeptical of the Easter story, in a very quick description, Pastor John, what's important to you to impart to our audience about Easter?
Every religion in the world except Christianity says you have to earn your way into eternity by being good enough. You have to say enough prayers or go on a spiritual journey or be reincarnated over and over again until you get it right, or meditate until you transcend or whatever. And you never know for sure if you're good enough. Christianity is the only religion that says no matter how good you are, you'll never be good enough. We aren't good enough to get to God, so he came to us. The Jewish people were waiting for a Messiah. If you read the Old Testament, hundreds of years before Jesus came, things were said about a man who would come and save them, and Jesus fulfilled those. But even the people who knew the Old Testament the best, they read the parts of the Bible of the Old Testament they liked, and they looked for a conquering king, not a servant, a suffering servant. Even Jesus' own disciples were shocked when he was arrested and killed. And he told them over and over, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be killed. He said, I have to. That's what the prophet said would happen to save people, for someone to pay the penalty for other people's sins. When he died on the cross, for the next few days, the disciples were absolutely devastated. Everything they'd hoped for, everything they believed in was destroyed. They couldn't see how anything good could ever come out of Jesus being killed. And then he rose from the dead, and the most amazing thing that ever happened in history. In fact, even if people are listening, don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, don't believe Jesus is our Savior, they cannot argue that Jesus Christ has influenced this world in radical ways. Some horrible things have been done in Jesus' name, and I think that would break his heart, but millions of incredible things have been done. In fact, most hospitals and medical places have happened because Jesus healed people, and people said, I don't have the miraculous ability to heal people, but I want to care for people in need. So God took the most heartbreaking thing in the world for Jesus' 12 disciples and turn it into the most world-changing thing that's ever happened in history. And so I guess that's the way I try to explain Easter briefly.
And that's not fair to give you just a short period of time to share about Easter. But I think for those that have heard the Easter story, that's a great reflection. It's a great review. It's a great summary. For those who haven't, that's a little dose of, we realize that there's a lot of things that have been done in the name of being Christian that people have been wronged. There's countless things, and we won't get into those, but there's countless things that humans do because we are not God. We are not perfect like Jesus. And just because someone says they're doing it in Jesus' name doesn't mean that they're actually doing that. So I think that Jesus was the greatest leader to ever come to the earth. And of course, if you look at the 12 disciples, and my favorite book of the Bible is Acts, because it's the most, in my opinion, most exciting. There's some other very exciting books in the Bible, but to have your leader die in such a public and, frankly, humiliating way, the crucifixion is one of the worst ways to die. And then to have Christianity spread the way it did is a miracle. And Jesus was the type of person that would give grace to people who deserved it and needed it, that a lot of humans wouldn't. And then he was also strict, and he was wise, and he would be very much on the side of truth for people that needed to be called out, that were hypocrites. So I have two follow-up questions about Easter. What would be maybe your character in the Easter story that you associate the most with?
Well, I love the fact that my mom named me John, my mom and dad. And if you read the Gospel of John, he writes the story of Jesus' life, and he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. But John also talked about John the Baptist. And there was a point where people started leaving John the Baptist and quit following John the Baptist to follow Jesus. One of John the Baptist's followers said, tell him to stop. And John the Baptist said, he must increase and I must decrease. Both John the Apostle and John the Baptist, their whole desire was to point people at Jesus, not to themselves, and say, I don't have anything special, but if you'll connect with him. So John was in the Last Supper with Jesus. John stood beside Jesus' mother Mary when Jesus was dying on the cross and said he would take care of, I hope he would take care of Jesus' mother. I hope that I'm a little bit like John.
I love that. And for what it's worth, I think a lot of people associate with the character Peter, with the Apostle Peter, and I do at times, but I have often, and I've written this down in prayer journals, I associate with Joseph of Arimathea actually the most as a business owner, and maybe someone that could help in a way where, it's a dangerous time, and he didn't want to necessarily be associated with giving away his tomb that he had paid for, but a very critical part in the Easter story. So that's one of the things that I've always associated with. Okay, leadership. We just spoke about how Jesus is one of the greatest leaders ever to be documented for sure. And as a pastor, you're a leader. So let's talk about some leadership questions for real estate professionals. I think that surrounding yourself with a team is very important. We accomplish so much more with others around us. So how do you go about selecting a team, and what do you do when you're surrounding a team when it comes to personal decisions that are really, really important for the church?
I think a step back before putting together a team is testing your own heart. You had asked about a prompting from God. We really have to say, am I in this for myself, and am I trying to manipulate people to help me get ahead in life? Or do I really care about people, and am I looking for a way to help other people benefit in life? I think it was Ronald Reagan who had the plaque on his desk that said, you can get a whole lot done if you don't care who gets the credit. Jesus said, if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, you have to be the servant of all that. That's backward for us. So I think the first thing you have to do as a leader is sit down and say, do I even care about other people, or am I just using people? Then if you come to the conclusion about, no, I want to help people succeed, whether it's helping my clients in your realm find the piece of real estate that's best for them, I'm not going to try to convince them to buy something just because I get a good commission. I want to make sure it's what they need. And I might even tell them, I can't give you what you need. That's humble. The same thing when you build a team, to sit down and say, you know what, I know you're going to benefit me, but I want to bless you. I hope I bless you more than you bless me. If you use, I want that you have more benefit from working with me than I have with you. And then, we use 4 C's, and we stole these from another church when we hire, or when we, even as volunteers, we say, is there a strong sense of calling on their life? Is this something from a Christian point of view they feel God's called them to? In your realm of work would be, are they passionate about this? The second thing is, do they have a level of competency? You can teach competency if they have potential, but are they competent? The third level is care. Well, actually, I should say character first. Are they a person of character and integrity? And then the last C is chemistry. Do we click? Are we going to get along? Some people are good people, but no matter what you do, you don't click. So, and we've actually had a 5th one now, which is culture. Do they fit in the culture of our organization? And so we try to meet with people, we interview, we do the best we can. Sometimes we miss it somewhere. We seldom miss on character. We seldom miss on calling in our realm. Competency is one that, until you work with somebody, you don't always know about. Chemistry is where we've missed more often than not, because when people interview, it's kind of like going on a date. You always put your best foot forward. But that's what I look for, is someone who says, man, I'm excited about this. I'm willing to give to, I'm a person of character. You can trust, I'll do what I say. And so I hope that helps.
It absolutely does. And I had never heard that before, of the 4 and now the 5th C. That's very helpful. And I think that as a leader, one of the things that happens is you have some people that work with you that are very talented, and there is a natural progression of, you kind of start here. And for me in real estate, I started as an assistant. I was on the administrative side. I graduated from college with a degree in finance. I had all this ambition, but felt very candidly, very scared about communicating to people who had a lot more wealth and a lot more experience than I did. So I said, I'm going to learn for 3 years. And it was sort of like an apprentice program. So you're going to have people as a leader that are going to work under you, and there's time for them to raise in the ranks, either through your organization, or maybe they're going to be recruited by another church or another organization. I know that for the leaders out there, this is very difficult when this happens, but how do you turn someone loose and say, it's your time. It's your time to lead. And I imagine you've gone through that both yourself as you've left different organizations, but then also as a leader of Crossroads.
Yeah. I'm sure you and the people listening have heard the quote, the best way to success is to hire people that are smarter than you. And I can't be smart about everything. And so that's part of what I do too, is my ego in check enough that if someone's better at something than I am, that I bring them on board and I celebrate how they're better at that. The crazy thing is, I went to seminary for 3 years with a master of divinity and learned how to preach and this and that. Now I'm hiring people that are like 22 or 23 years old that understand technology in ways I have no clue, and they have to mentor me. John, it's better if you do it this way, or if we could use a drone to, it's like, holy smoke. So So what I've tried, and I have people in accounting and finance that are smarter than me, and I try to ask questions because they're accountable to me, but I count on them to advise me. And the result is they grow, they progress, so they're smart, they're gifted, they're going to get attention. The interesting thing in the church world is, and you hear me say this all the time, other churches aren't the competition. We're all a part of the same kingdom. We want to see God's kingdom grow. It's kind of like the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Maybe if a Navy guy sitting next to a Marine in a bar, they might get in a fight, but if they're in a foxhole together, they'll become best friends, And so what we say all the time is other churches aren't the competition. We have lost really gifted staff members because they've grown in a larger church, notices that, and we try to celebrate who they are and what they've done and say, look, we've been able to help this person be a success. The fun thing is we've had 2 or 3 people who left our church to go to another ministry that were part-time when they started, and then came back and said, I'd rather be on your team. I mean, because maybe the grass looks greener, or they could pay me more, but now I'm in a different place. And so I think if people know you are for them, and I really don't understand the real estate industry. I know there's got to be some competitiveness, like if they sell that place, they get the deal and I don't. But if as human beings we say, I want success and blessing for everyone, my employees, I'll celebrate when another company does well. I know that guy. I'm going to call on him and say, hey, way to go. If we celebrate and help each other out, and maybe when you have you're trying to help someone with a property and say, I hate to say this, but Joe over there could help you more. I'm always impressed with people who do that. I'm not like, wow, they're a loser. So you got to hold people with open arms, open hands, and trust that if you are a person of integrity and character and compassion, the right people and the right things will come your way when they need to. And maybe it's better for that person to move on.
It's great advice. And in the business world, one of the key topics now that's going around, at least for the past decade, is the idea of an abundance mindset. And an abundance mindset I have used on this podcast to describe it. And you'll know exactly what I'm speaking about because I share about Crossroads Christmas Eve service. We don't go to church on Christmas at Crossroads. We enjoy that day with our family, but Christmas Eve, there's some beautiful services, and we end every Christmas Eve service with a candle lighting. And the idea of an abundance mindset versus a finite mindset or a win-lose mindset is that the win-lose mindset or the finite mindset is the world's a pie and I got to get my slice and I might get 11% or 12% or 13% market share or 40 or whatever you think that your pie should be depending on what your marketplace is. The abundance mindset is one candle lights up a whole room. And that doesn't diminish the existing candle. It's not like one candle has to go out to light the next one. And I just love that. It's such a beautiful thing. If you've ever been through a candlelight vigil or through a Christmas service, it's just a beautiful demonstration of that. Okay, I know every leader has had some mentors. So by name, who are some important men and women that have mentored you throughout your life as a pastor and as a spiritual leader?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say my mom. I mean, my dad died when I was 5. She's a 36-year-old widow with 4 kids between the ages of 4 and 11, and was an incredibly positive. She actually listened to Zig Ziglar and stuff when I was a kid, and she had a little sticker in her car that says, a big shot is just a little shot that kept shooting. And, when I got in trouble, she'd sit down and say, Johnny, Jesus loves you too much to let you get away with that. You might as well quit doing so. So my mom, I had a youth pastor named Pastor Frank and we had a large youth group. So he didn't mentor me one-on-one, but he always encouraged me. And then I had Bob Bowman, who became the next youth pastor, who probably took me under his arm even more. My lead pastor, we had a church of 1,400 when I was a kid, but Pastor Sloan knew me by name. He was the inspiration in a lot of ways that said, I want to do what he does. I want to help people like he does. Then a man named Al Broom, who worked with Church Dynamics International, he was the mentor who said I wouldn't make a good lead pastor, but he trained me in lots of things, how to tell people about Jesus, how to help mentor people. And again, and I didn't spend a lot of one-on-one with him. I was in a group setting. Most of my mentors, real honestly, have been mentors from a distance. John Maxwell that's deeply, deeply influenced me. Rick Warren, and I've met these people. John Maxwell for a while knew me by name. I don't know if he ran into me today, if he would. I've met Rick Warren, he wouldn't know me, but I go to these conferences with these gifted, high character, high producing people. I listen, I read their books, Erwin McManus, and then of course there's mentors from previous generations. A.W. Tozer was a pastor whose book I read called Pursuing God, The Pursuit of God, and C.S. Lewis. And so most of my mentors, and I've literally, Kyle, it's interesting. I say that lead pastors are like eagles. They don't flock. They're kind of like the captain of their own ship. But I've actually 3 different times contacted men who are older than me, farther along in ministry, and said, would you be willing to mentor me? But they didn't live in the same community, and they said yes. And I would initiate phone calls, and none of the things ever went as far as I wished. So in some ways, I wish I had some closer mentors, but I've had a lot of colleagues as well. You know, there's people above you that mentor you, and then there's your peers that challenge you. And then, real honestly, when you're mentoring other people, they raise your bar because you have to learn. So I'm a people person, had a lot of people in my life and many positive ones.
2 questions before we near the end of our interview that I didn't prepare you for, but are follow-ups to what you just said. I believe that and I stole this from Dave Ramsey, but every man that I respect married up. I just believe that. And I know your wife, Kathy, I've heard you speak from the platform, but I also just know from having met her, she's a tremendous influence in your life. As you walk through decisions throughout your life, and also just the concept of praying together, let's just talk about Kathy real quick. And just, it wouldn't be a mentor. That would kind of feel a little bit goofy because mentors come and go. But what's the power of a spouse that is like Kathy, and that's Courtney for me, that you really feel like, man, I don't know if somehow she's going to realize that she married me, you know? So how does that work for you as you embark on important decisions?
You know, there's a lot of things as a pastor that people share with you that are to be confidential. But I found out early on in my marriage, the Bible says we are one. And my wife always found out maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, and then she'd say, why didn't you tell me you were dealing with that? So I just let people know, no matter what's going on in my life, I pass it by my wife. My wife is one of the most compassionate people I know. Her language of love is giving gifts. I'm just amazed, even during this COVID-19 crisis, she's calling people or saying, I wonder if I could take these flowers over and put them on so-and-so's doorstep to brighten their day. When we would have funerals and people in the hospital, she's the one who said, John, did you think to send flowers to those people? When we were thinking about moving to Arizona to start a church, obviously we prayed together, and I couldn't have done it if she hadn't said, I think God wants us to do this too. So she's more quick to say we ought to pray about this than I am. Sometimes we had a friend who called up and asked for some counsel because they had to talk to someone who was a superior to them because they didn't understand why their superior was doing something. And I gave some counsel to them. And then my wife was on the phone and said, well, have you thought about saying, how do you feel like things are going right now, so-and-so? And do you feel good about it? You know, and my friend basically snubbed me and said, oh, you're right, Kathy, that's what, and because he asked him how he thought things were going, it led into a conversation instead of me saying, well, I'd just say, I don't think things are working, you know. So Kathy, yeah, I mean, it's wise to live with and trust, you know, love is powerful and trust is powerful, but when you put love and trust together, there's nothing more powerful.
That's beautiful. And I feel the same way about Courtney. I process so many decisions and really bounce ideas off of her. And I want to make sure that we're building a lifestyle, we're building a business that she would respect and that would honor. And I feel like every great relationship, and I had this described to me at one point where, if you stand, and I think it's a couples retreat type of exercise where you stand back to back and the couple describes what each other is seeing. And of course they're describing two completely different things because they're not facing the same direction. A great couple complements each other. And when she sees what I miss and I am able to do what she's not comfortable, I'm a wide open, enthusiastic guy. If we need to grab something around the neighborhood, she says, "Hey, Kyle, I've researched this. I've done all the details. Now you go get it." And that's the roles that we play. And I just love that. The second follow-up question is, I know about the importance of small groups. And I know that our church places a lot of importance in that. Some people might not have heard that term, small groups. In the business setting, people call them mastermind groups or mastery groups. How do you set up a small group, especially in a faith application? And what are some of the wonderful things that happen? And about how long does a small group get together for?
And there are so many different means of doing that. When we went and started the church in Arizona, we had 4 of us. We only had 5 staff members, and 3 of us had led small groups before, and 1 was a volunteer. And we started right away by saying you ought to connect. And what we did then is we would get people together in groups of 8 to 16. 1 would be the leader, and immediately the leader would look for an apprentice, someone else that might be a relational person. They'd have a host home so that people took ownership and said, I may not be a leader, but I'm welcoming people into my home. We always start with non-threatening questions, hey, tell me where you lived when you were 8 years old, or, are you more like your mom or your dad, or why, or, just so people could begin to open up in a very safe environment. But hopefully the goal was in time, people would trust each other enough to say, my wife and I had a huge fight yesterday and we don't know what to do, or my child is rebelling right now or doing drugs, or, we're going to keep this confidential and safe, but do you know how to help me? And what I say is, it isn't a matter of if something difficult is going to happen in life, it's a matter of when. And when something happens, do you have a family? Do you have a group of people who will come around you? So when I first came to Crossroads, what we said is you can start a small group doing anything you want. Riding horses, playing cards is what somebody wanted. We wanted to play cards. They wanted to play cards. Sewing, or we're going to study a book of the Bible. And then we told our people in our church, you can go to one of the, I actually got, I think, 10 couples together for 3 months, and I led them through a small group. The people, I said, you could be leaders, and introduced the ideas, and I said, there needs to be 4 elements to every small group. There needs to be a relational interaction where you just catch up with each other. There needs to be kind of some spiritual emphasis from our point of view. Whether it's one person telling their story about how they figured out who Jesus was, or the leader reading a few verses from the Bible. There needs to be a prayer time, and there needs to be some social time afterwards. So we did those 4 things. Well, someone said, I'd like to start a card group. Well, what they did is we had 70 people sign up to play cards. I couldn't get 70 people to pray, but they would come in, and while they were playing cards, they had an icebreaker question on the table, what if you could go on vacation anywhere, where would you go and why? And they'd play cards, but they'd start at 7, they'd stop at 8, and they went in the living room and said, okay, does anybody need prayer? And then they'd pray, and then they'd go have some social interaction afterwards. We had to break that into like 3 different groups, and then the amazing thing was a neighbor of one of the families said, how come there's all those cars at your house on Tuesday? And I said, well, we have people from our church come play cards. And they said, could we come over too? And these people didn't go to church. And the funny thing is that they played cards, and then the icebreaker question, and then at 8 o'clock, they got sucked into a prayer meeting. And about 4 weeks into it, they said, would you pray for our child? Now what we do is we have different levels of groups. We ask people, would you be willing to meet with 4 or 5 other couples for a year or 2 in what we call a life group? And we give them 8 weeks to get to know each other. We give them each week, someone tells their life story and some kind of exercise. And then at the end of 8 weeks, they say, yes, I want to meet with this group for long term, or no, this doesn't seem like a fit, and I'll make a commitment for a year or 2. and they try once a month to include a service project in there, so they're doing something to care for others. Those are our life groups. We also have what we call connecting groups, and those might be 13 weeks, and might be a study on the book of John. But even in the Bible study, we say, make sure you ask people, what do you need prayer for? Or if one of your friends ends up sick, take them a meal. Maybe it's a group around parenting. Maybe it's Dave Ramsey's. You know, we have Financial Peace University, and people sit around tables, and after they watch the video, they discuss things. Our women's ministry have 200 women every Wednesday and one morning, and then another 200 Wednesday nights sitting around tables. There's a master teacher, and then after the master teaching, they sit and talk around the table about what they learned, but they also share what's going on in their lives. My wife is a part of that, and one of her friends, her and her husband both were diagnosed with COVID-19, and we've been praying. Kathy and I are in a life group with 4 other couples that we have known for 20 years. And we meet every Wednesday night. We'll meet tonight. We're going to meet by Zoom tonight. Sometimes we go out to a meal. Sometimes we go work at Secor, this organization that provides meals for children. Sometimes we do Bible study, but it's just, and we have been at the hospital when Bob had to have part of his kidney removed, and all of us were there. And it's just a way of getting through life together.
I so appreciate the story about the card group. And you've mentioned this from the platform, that oftentimes people are anxious about going into a church, even when a church is in an old car dealership, or like you said, when you were planting a church and it was done in a movie theater, you know, before the matinee started going. People are just anxious about that, or worried. Maybe they feel like they're going to be judged. But going and playing cards, and all of a sudden, you know, they get some spiritual enrichment, some uplift, some prayer. It's a wonderful thing. And I think so many people feel like faith has to be done a certain way. And growing up Catholic, that very much felt that way, that here's how you do it. Here's the dogma, here's the ritual. But I know from both being taught by you, but then also just really experiencing and walking with Jesus, that it should be done every single day in your vocation, in your daily walk. I just love that idea. All right, a couple of quick questions before we end. These are quick hitters. Ready for them?
I hope so.
All right. So I have been always fascinated to learn how great speakers, and I believe you're a great speaker, prepare for speaking to a large audience.
You know, one, I have to sit down, and it's interesting speaking week after week after week after week after week to the same people. I don't design 5 great lectures and travel around the world. So the first thing I have to do is, and I do this by praying. Others might do it just by thinking or researching. And I do it because I meet, if someone asks to meet with me, I will meet with them within a week of them asking. So I have to sit down and say, what is going on in the lives of our people? What do they need to hear right now? So first I have to evaluate what they need to hear. Then I have to say, what does the Bible have to say to that? And I look for illustrations and resources and thoughts from other people that would give encouragement to that. And I'm all about encouragement, not about rebuke. You know, sometimes people need that. And then I have to sit down and say, where am I going to carve out the time to put thought together a message that's memorable, got some humor in it, but it gives people hope. Sometimes I'm very envious of the people who go around and do lecture speaking, because it'd be nice to have 5 lectures and fine tune them and know how to connect with an audience. And you connect with a smaller audience different than you do a large audience. But I always carve out Monday to start working on my messages, so that when I get the outline in my head, I have all week long to think about it. I read a great preacher from the 1800s said, if someone said I had a lot of time to study, but I didn't have much time with people, eventually their messages become become remote. If they say I had a lot of time with people, but I didn't have much time studying, their messages become petty. And the conclusion I've come to is, if I'm going to be an in-touch, in-tune preacher who speaks out of my own personality, but to the hearts of my people, every week I'm going to end the week saying I should have spent more time with people, and I should have spent more time studying, because just more that, but if I have that tension in my life, I'm probably pretty balanced on being able to offer something of hope.
That's a great answer. All right, next question. You may have answered it. We'll see. Which book of the Bible is your favorite?
You know, Gosh, I don't even know how to answer that. I really don't, because it'd be like saying which of your children is your favorite child. You know, they all have a different personality. I love the Psalms that speak from the heart. I love Proverbs that speak to the mind. I love the book of John that tells the story of Jesus. I love the book of Ephesians that talks about how first it starts by how we're blessed with heavenly blessings. And it says, and if that's true, then this is how we ought to live and how we ought to treat our wives. And so I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer. Like I said, don't ask me which of my children I love more, you know.
That's okay.
I love them in different ways.
I happen to really enjoy Proverbs. Is there a proverb that you have memorized or that really sticks with you that just like, boom, might be applicable for our audience?
There's two. The first one is, there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to destruction. That we think we know what we're doing, and if we aren't careful, and it goes along with the other proverb, which is trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he'll direct your paths. So if instead of listening to my longings, urges, impulses, and desires and going the way they say, if God says there's a better way to do it, that instead of leaning on my own understanding, I trust in God and go his way, there's just a lot more success in life. I mean, there's others like, you know, he who refreshes others will be himself refreshed. A generous man will be blessed. There's just a ton.
The neat thing I heard Dave Ramsey say a long time ago, and I've done this a couple of times now, is that the months that have 31 days, there are 31 proverbs. And if you're just learning how to read the Bible, that's a really great way, especially if you're in business and you want to learn about things about leadership. You can read one proverb a day, and it's fairly digestible, and you get through it, and it's a rhythm. It was a good way for me to start reading the Bible. Last two questions, and we get every single guest to answer these questions, regardless of what their experience is. So first question is the Dear Younger Me question, a song written by the band Mercy Me, a Christian group that I absolutely love. And the idea is you're writing a letter to yourself now that you've lived some life. And I have dubbed this question as the advice you wish you knew when you were 22. So what's the Dear Younger Me that John would write to himself if he was 22 years old?
I've always, I played football, and my big thing, I'd yell at my friends and I'd say to myself is, make something happen, make something happen, make something happen. When I was 22, I ignored my struggles. I ignored my discouragement. I ignored my depression. I just said, I'm going to go out and make something happen. Doggone it. If somebody else isn't doing something good, I'm going to go do something good. And I think when I was 46 and I finally realized I was depressed, that it was because I ignored negative things. I tried to stay positive all the time, and I didn't grieve when I needed to grieve. And I think I would say, slow down. I'll be 64 in 2 weeks. You're going to have another 40 years to do all the things you want to do. Learn from people that are older than you, which I think I try to do, but be in tune to your emotions and don't ignore negative things, and take time to grieve, stay positive, work hard, try to make things happen, but it isn't all on your shoulders.
The follow-up question that we have not asked all of our guests on our podcast because it came out of a guest's answer. And unfortunately, this is a different career coach than Rory, but one of my career coaches, Chris Oakley, a wonderful Christian man, passed away tragically last year in December. When I interviewed him prior to that accident, his answer was that he was in a mentoring group in his 20s with several Christian men, and they had him read the book Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley. And in that book, there's an exercise where you have to write your own obituary. Now, you have delivered a lot of memorial services, funeral services as a pastor. I almost think of this kind of in a joking way, maybe adding some light to what some people might be scared about, which is death. That old commercial from the 90s of, Tombstone Pizza. What do you want on your tombstone? That kind of idea. What legacy would you hope to lead, or if someone was delivering either writing an obituary or delivering a eulogy, what would you hope they'd say about John Snyder?
This is very much like Stephen Covey's Begin with the End in Mind. And I've thought about it. I hope if someone was giving a speech, not just on my tombstone, they'd say, John may not have succeeded at everything in life, but man, he succeeded at loving God, and he cared about his wife and his kids and his family. And John was a friend, not just of people who knew Jesus, but he was a friend to sinners like Jesus was. And he never gave up hope on those. And he pointed people to God because he knew John didn't have what they needed, Jesus did.
Pastor John, I appreciate you sharing that message of hope. And it gives me two opportunities here to share some scripture quotes before we close. So on my wall, as I'm looking across, I have the quote, and it was something, a nice artist rendering of Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future." And I think that's an important message with this podcast, and then also just in this time where we're all hunkered down, staying at home, trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And then finally, I want to share.
Hang on, Kyle.
Oh, you check that out. I love it. We are kindred spirits, and Courtney knows that. And she said this is going to be one of the easier interviews for you because you and John are cut from the same cloth. So that's great that you've got that on your wall. Second was from the book of Hebrews, and this is really the golden thread throughout our interview today, was a sermon that I heard Pastor John do a month ago about Hebrews 11:8-10. And it says, "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs of him and of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." And as a real estate professional, I have to remember that. And I have a good friend named James Nellis that'll probably listen to this, that actually prays for each family that he helps buy a house. And if it's a new construction, he actually prays on the framework, on the framing of the house, that God is the architect, God is the builder of everything. And just a wonderful way to end our interview for us to say Happy Easter. Pastor John, thank you so much for being willing to share your time and your wisdom. And as I love to say to our podcast audience, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.